The stink came first, a thick, cloying blanket of death and damp feathers that clung to her like wet paper. It was the smell of the end of things. She had breathed it for so long it had become a part of her, sinking into her hair, her skin, the frayed wool of the dress that was less a garment and more a record of her sorrows. They had left her among the dead chickens. The crate was rough-hewn pine, splintered and foul, and it sat in the merciless sun at the edge of the dusty settlement that barely deserved the name of town. Chickens, meant for market, had perished in the heat, and she, a different kind of commodity, had been tossed in with them, a final insult from a man who dealt only in insults. Her world was reduced to the slivers of light that cut through the slats of the crate. They sliced across the stiff, angled bodies of the birds, illuminating a single, unblinking glass eye, a splayed wing. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, tiny golden worlds oblivious to the decay around them. She did not move. To move was to invite notice, and notice was the herald of pain. So she remained still, a statue carved from resignation, her breath shallow, her gaze fixed on nothing. Outside, the world was a cacophony of disembodied sounds. The crunch of boots on parched earth. The low murmur of voices, some curious, some contemptuous. A woman's sharp laugh that cut the air like a shard of glass. They were a shapeless crowd, a gathering of judgment that eddied around her cage. She was a spectacle, a diversion from the endless monotony of dust and wind. She had learned to make herself small, to retract into a hard, silent core deep inside. It was a place no one could touch. They could have her body, her labor, her silence, but they could not have that last tiny kernel of self. It was all she had left. Her bare feet were pressed against the sticky floor of the crate, toes curled away from the cold, stiff flesh of a dead bird. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the pine boards, turning the crate into an oven. The stench ripened. The voices outside faded in and out, a tide of noise against the shore of her silence. She felt a thirst so profound it was like a living thing inside her, clawing at her throat. But she made no sound. To ask for water was to admit a need, and to admit a need was to be vulnerable. Then, a new sound. A pair of boots that walked differently. They did not shuffle or scuff. Each step was deliberate, heavy with a weariness that seemed to press into the very ground. The boots stopped near the crate. The murmuring of the crowd quieted, a subtle shift in the atmosphere. She didn't look up, didn't dare. She just listened to the silence that this man's presence had created. He carried whole winters in his eyes. Silas had seen enough of the world to know its casual cruelties. He stood a little apart from the others, his duster coated in the fine, pale dust of the plains, his hands calloused from work, not violence. He watched the crate, not with the prurient curiosity of the others, but with a deep, unsettling stillness. He saw not the spectacle, but the abomination. A man named Fletcher, puffed up with the importance of owning something, even if it was just a woman in a box, swaggered over. "Well now, Silas. Come to gawk like the rest." Silas's gaze didn't move from the crate. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly like it came from under floorboards. "What's your price for the chickens?" Fletcher laughed, a wet, unpleasant sound. "The chickens are worthless. Died in the heat. It's what's with 'em that's for sale." Jedediah left her. Said his debt to me was paid. Silas's eyes, the color of a stormy sky, finally lifted to meet Fletcher's. There was no anger in them, just a flat, dismissive emptiness that was somehow more unnerving. "Jedediah's debts are his own." "Not anymore," Fletcher preened. "She's mine to sell. Good for farm work, I reckon. Once you get the stink off her." Silas reached into his coat. The movement was slow, measured. He pulled out a small leather pouch and loosened the drawstring. He let 3 silver coins fall into his palm, the metal dull against his cracked skin. He looked at Fletcher, then back at the crate. "I'll take her," he said. The words were not an offer. They were a statement of fact. Fletcher's eyes widened at the sight of the silver. It was more than he'd ever have gotten. Greed warred with his blustering pride, and greed won easily. He snatched the coins from Silas's hand. "She's all yours. Don't come crying to me if she's broken." Silas ignored him. He walked to the crate and unlatched the simple rope hasp. The crowd, which had been holding its collective breath, let it out in a soft hiss of whispers. He pulled the lid open. The stench billowed out, thick and suffocating. The woman inside didn't flinch. She was huddled against the far side, her face turned away, her hair a tangled mat of straw and filth. Her hands were bound in front of her with a piece of coarse rope. Without a word, Silas pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his trousers. He opened it with his thumb, the click of the blade sharp in the sudden quiet. He reached in, not toward her, but toward the ropes that bound her wrists. He saw how they had cut into her skin, red and raw. He sliced through the fibers with one clean, decisive cut. The rope fell away. Her hands remained pressed together for a moment as if they had forgotten how to be separate. He stepped back, giving her space, creating a small sanctuary of distance between her and the watching eyes. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak a word of comfort. He just waited. Slowly, like a creature unfolding after a long winter, she moved. Her hands parted. She pressed them flat against the floor of the crate, testing her own freedom. Then she looked up, and for the first time he saw her face. It was a canvas of exhaustion and dirt, but her eyes were clear and deep, and they held his for a fraction of a second before skittering away. In that moment, he saw not a broken thing, but a person holding on by a thread. She climbed out of the crate, her movements stiff and uncertain. The sun made her squint. The open space seemed to intimidate her. She stood barefoot in the dust, a frail figure in a ruined dress, clutching her newly freed hands in front of her as if to ward off the world. Silas turned his back on the town and gestured with his head toward the lone horse and wagon waiting at the edge of the road. Come on. The journey was a long, slow passage through a land that was as stripped and silent as she was. The wagon wheels ground a steady rhythm against the hard-packed dirt, a sound that measured the distance they were putting between themselves and the town. Dust lifted behind them like pale ghosts. She sat on the wagon bed, her back pressed against a sack of flour, her knees drawn up to her chest. She did not look at him. She looked at the vast, empty expanse of the plains, the horizon a stark line drawn by an unforgiving hand. The wind was a constant presence, pulling at the loose strands of her hair, whispering secrets she did not want to hear. Silas did not try to speak. Words were clumsy things, and he had never been good with them. Silence had its own language, and he trusted it more. He could feel her presence behind him, a small, tight knot of fear and watchfulness. He kept the horse to a steady, unhurried walk, a pace that did not spook or rush. Hours passed. The sun beat down, and he heard a small, dry sound from behind him, the rasp of a throat raw with thirst. He reached for his canteen without turning around. He held it back over his shoulder. For a long moment, there was nothing. He kept his arm steady and offering without expectation. Then he felt the weight of the canteen lighten as small, hesitant hands took it from him. He heard the soft unscrewing of the cap, the sound of careful swallowing. She did not gulp the water down, but sipped it slowly, as if reintroducing herself to kindness. When she was done, the canteen was pressed back into his waiting hand. It was the first time they had touched this brief, impersonal exchange. They arrived as dusk was bleeding blood orange and violet across the sky. The homestead was a lonely silhouette against the fading light. It was not a place of welcome. The house was small, built of weathered gray wood that had surrendered its paint to the sun and wind years ago. A fence sagged in one corner. A lone grave, marked by a simple wooden cross, stood under a wind-stunted tree. The whole place seemed to be holding its breath, caught in a state of perpetual waiting. It was a house that mirrored the man who lived in it. Silas brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. His movements were stiff with fatigue. He did not tell her what to do, but simply began unhitching the horse. She watched him for a moment, her eyes taking in the stark isolation of the place. This was her new cage, larger than the last, but a cage nonetheless. She slid off the wagon, her bare feet sinking into the cool, soft dust. He led the horse to the barn, and she followed at a distance, a shadow tracking a shadow. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and dry earth. It was neat, organized. Tools hung in their proper places. There was an order here that the rest of the world lacked. When he was done, he led the way to the house. The door creaked open into a single large room. It was sparse, functional. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black. A sturdy table with 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made, was tucked into a corner. The air inside was still and cool, thick with the scent of wood smoke and solitude. Silas gestured to a small cot against the far wall. It was bare except for a thin mattress. You sleep there. He went to a chest at the foot of his own bed and pulled out a thick wool blanket. It was clean and smelled of cedar. He laid it on the cot. He did not look at her. Next, he moved to the hearth. He built a fire with practiced, economical movements, and soon the small room was filled with a warm, flickering light that pushed the shadows into the corners. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. He put a pot of water on to boil and cut thick slices from a loaf of dark bread. He found a piece of salted pork and added it to the water along with a handful of dried beans. The smell of food, simple and hearty, began to fill the silence. She had not moved from the doorway, a ghost caught between 2 worlds. He looked at her then, his face illuminated by the firelight. The hardness in his features seemed to soften in the warm glow. You're safe here, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I don't lock my doors. He set 2 bowls on the table, 2 spoons. He filled them with the hot, steaming stew. He sat in one of the chairs and began to eat. He did not watch her, did not command her. The invitation was in the second bowl, the second spoon, the empty chair. For a long time she remained where she was. Then hunger, a force more powerful than fear, won out. She moved across the room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floorboards. She pulled out the chair and sat down. She picked up the spoon. Her hand trembled, but she raised it to her lips. The stew was hot, salty, real. It was the first warm meal she'd had in a lifetime. They ate in silence as the fire crackled, stitching their lives together with the raw thread of a shared meal. The days settled into a rhythm, as predictable and steady as the rising and setting of the sun. It was a life measured not in words, but in work. Silas would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would go out to the barn, and she would hear the familiar sounds of his morning chores, the pump handle groaning, the low nicker of the horse, the sharp ring of an axe splitting wood. At first, she stayed inside the house, a prisoner of her own volition. She would sweep the floors, her movements listless, her eyes vacant. The house was a shell, and she moved within it like a phantom. But the stillness began to feel more oppressive than any cage. One morning, she followed him out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. He was mending the section of sagging fence, his back to her. He did not acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of it. She watched his hands, strong and capable, as he stretched the wire taut and hammered in a new staple. She found a pile of discarded wood near the chopping block. Without a thought, she began to stack it, arranging the pieces into a neat, stable pile against the side of the house. It was a small, simple task, but it was a choice. Her choice. When Silas turned from the fence, he saw the finished woodpile. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and went back to his work. A silent contract was forged between them. He worked the land and she worked the house. She learned the geography of his grief. She found a small, locked room. She did not try the handle more than once. She tended the lone grave under the tree, pulling the weeds that grew around the simple cross, sometimes leaving a wild prairie flower she'd found. She never asked who was buried there. She knew it was a question the silence could not answer. She found a box of mending supplies. His shirts were frayed at the cuffs, his trousers worn at the knee. In the evenings, by the firelight, she would sit on her cot and sew. Her stitches were small and neat. She darned his socks. She patched his coat. Each stitch was a word she could not say, a small anchor in the vast, quiet sea of their life together. He, in turn, offered his own quiet cares. One evening, when the wind turned mean and bit with the first hint of winter, he came in from the barn and laid a heavy wool shawl on her cot. It was old and soft, clearly a woman's. It likely belonged to the woman in the locked room, the woman under the cross. She ran her hand over the fabric, the texture a ghost of a life she would never know. That night, she wrapped it around her shoulders, and its warmth felt like a shield. He noticed her bare feet, chapped and sore from the rough ground. He left for town one morning and returned late in the afternoon. He placed a small parcel on the table without a word. Inside were a pair of sturdy leather boots, plain and practical. They were not new, but they were well-oiled and sound. She put them on. They fit as if they were made for her. She walked across the floor, the solid sound of her footsteps a new and definitive statement. She had a place to stand. The silence between them began to change. It was no longer a heavy, watchful thing, but a comfortable space, a shared territory. It was the quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for explanation. One day, she tried to bake bread. The result was a hard, dense loaf that could have been used to stone a cat. She placed it on the table between them, her face a mask of disappointment. Silas cut a piece with his knife, the effort making his knuckles turn white. He chewed it thoughtfully for a long time. That loaf died in vain, she muttered, staring into her stew. He swallowed. A little dry. She looked up, a flash of something annoyance, amusement in her eyes. You didn't complain about mine, he said, his mouth twitching at the corner. It was the closest he had ever come to a joke. A tiny crack appeared in the wall of her reserve, and a flicker of a smile, brief and fragile as a moth's wing, touched her lips before vanishing. The true shift came on a night when the wind howled around the small house like a hungry wolf. A storm had blown in, a furious tantrum of rain and lightning. She was jolted from a shallow sleep by a sound that came from her own throat, a choked cry of terror. She was back in the darkness, the smell of rot and fear filling her lungs. Hands were grabbing at her, voices were laughing. She fought, thrashing against the confines of the dream, her breath coming in ragged sobs. "No," she whimpered, her voice thin and reedy. "Don't lock me in. Please." A large shadow fell over her. Her eyes flew open. Silas was standing by her cot, his form a dark mountain against the flickering firelight. His face was etched with a concern so deep it looked like pain. He did not reach for her, did not touch her. He just stood there, a silent, solid anchor in the storm of her fear. "You're not there," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're here. The door isn't locked." Her breathing was still ragged, her body trembling. He remained by her side until the shaking subsided, until the ghosts of her past retreated back into the shadows. He did not go back to his bed. He pulled one of the chairs close to the hearth and sat down, keeping watch. She drifted into a dreamless sleep, protected not by a lock and key, but by the quiet vigil of a kind man. The next day, the world was washed clean. The rain had passed, leaving the air fresh and the dust settled. They worked in the garden he had started to turn over, side by side, their hands in the cool, damp earth. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost lost in the vastness of the sky. She did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the small green shoot she was planting. "Why did you take me?" Silas stopped his work. He rested his hands on his spade, looking out at the horizon. He thought of the wife he had lost to fever, the child she had carried with her into the silent earth. He thought of the crushing loneliness of the years that followed. He thought of the ugliness in Fletcher's eyes, the casual cruelty of the world. He could have told her any of these things. Instead, he gave her the simplest, truest answer he had. "I saw a person," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself. "And they were in a cage. Seemed to me the only thing a decent man could do was open the door." She did not reply, but she planted the small shoot in the ground with a new and tender firmness. She was no longer just a survivor. She was planting a root. In this hard, unforgiving soil, something was beginning to grow. The peace they had built was as fragile as a skim of ice on a winter pond. They both knew it. The past was not a dead thing, it was a patient hunter, and one day it would come to find them. The harbinger appeared on a bright, clear afternoon. It was not a letter, not a plume of smoke. It was two riders on the horizon, their forms small and dark against the endless blue of the sky. They were too far away to be identified, but a cold knot of certainty tightened in her stomach. She had been looking for them every day without realizing it. She was hanging laundry on the line Silas had strung between the house and the barn, his shirts, her one spare dress, the sheets from their beds. The clothespins were smooth in her hand. The scent of lye and sun-warmed cotton filled the air. It was a simple, domestic act, an act that belonged to a life she was just beginning to believe she deserved. Then she saw them. She froze, a white sheet clutched in her hand, the fabric flapping in the wind like a flag of surrender. Silas was in the barn, sharpening the blade of a scythe. The rhythmic scrape of stone on steel was a peaceful, industrious sound. She dropped the sheet into the basket and walked toward the barn, her new boots making no sound in the soft dirt. She did not need to speak. He looked up from his work and saw her face. He saw the stillness there, the old, familiar resignation beginning to reclaim her features. He followed her gaze out to the horizon, to the two riders who were now visibly closer. His hands stopped moving. The peaceful sound was replaced by a heavy, waiting silence. He set the scythe down carefully. He wiped his hands on his trousers, a slow, deliberate gesture. He looked at her, and his eyes were not asking a question. They were making a promise. He walked past her, out of the barn and toward the house. She watched him go, then her gaze drifted back to the approaching riders. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Jedediah rode a fine black horse that danced and sidled, impatient with the slow pace of the nag beside it. He had always liked things that looked good, things that announced his importance to the world. He wore a waistcoat of brocaded silk and a self-satisfied smirk. The man with him was thick-set and dull-eyed, a hired fist. They reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on the wild roses she had coaxed into blooming near the steps. Jedediah's eyes scanned the small homestead with contempt, lingering for a moment on the neat woodpile, the mended fence. "Well, I'll be," he drawled, his voice oily and loud in the quiet air. "Looks like my lost property found itself a little hovel to squat in." Silas stood on the porch, his body framed by the doorway. He was not a large man, but he seemed to take up the entire space. He held no weapon. His hands were empty at his sides. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice flat and even. State your business and be on your way. Jedediah laughed, a sound that grated on the nerves. My business is on your porch. I've come to collect what's mine. I left her with Fletcher to settle a gambling debt, but I've had a change of heart. And a change of fortune. He patted a fat purse hanging from his belt. I've come to buy back my contract. She is not a contract, Silas said. The words were stones dropped into a deep well. She is a person. And she is not for sale. Jedediah's smirk tightened. Oh, I think she is. Everything has a price. I paid for her once, fair and square. She belongs to me by right. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the ground with an arrogant swagger. The hired man remained on his horse, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol. You have no right here, Silas said, his voice dropping lower, gaining an edge of cold iron. You have no right to her. You forfeited that when you left her in a box to rot. That was a misunderstanding, Jedediah said, waving a dismissive hand. A lesson. She needed to learn her place. He started toward the porch steps. Now, are you going to step aside like a sensible man? Or do I have to have my associate persuade you? Silas did not move. He was a rock, an immovable object rooted in the soil of his own land, his own principles. You'll take another step, you'll find out. From inside the house, she had heard every word. Each syllable from Jedediah's mouth was a cold hand reaching for her, trying to drag her back into the darkness. Fear, cold and familiar, coiled in her belly. Her first instinct was to hide, to make herself small, to retreat to that silent place deep inside. But then she saw Silas standing alone on the porch, a quiet, unassuming man willing to face down a storm for her. She looked at her hands, no longer bound but callous now from work, from planting, from mending. She looked at the sturdy boots on her feet. She was not the same woman who had huddled among dead chickens. A different feeling began to burn through the fear. It was hot and bright and unfamiliar. It was anger. The screen door creaked open. Both men turned. She stepped out onto the porch, moving to stand beside Silas. She did not stand behind him. She stood with him. Jedediah's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with possessive fury. There you are. Stop this foolishness and come here. He took a step up onto the porch, his hand reaching for her arm. No, she said. The word was not loud. It was not a scream or a plea. It was quiet, clear, and absolute. It was the first time she had ever said no to him, to any of them. The sound of her own voice, speaking her own will, was a revelation. Jedediah froze, his hand hovering in the air. He looked from her to Silas, his face contorting in a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. What did you say? She said no, Silas repeated, his voice calm. It's a word you'd do well to learn. Enraged, Jedediah lunged, not for Silas, but for her. It was a mistake. As his hand shot out, she moved with a speed born of pure instinct. She slapped him. The sound was sharp and loud, a crack of thunder in the tense silence. It was not a powerful blow, but it was delivered with the full weight of her reclaimed self. Jedediah stumbled back, his hand flying to his cheek, his face a picture of stunned outrage. He had been struck by his property. The humiliation was more than his fragile ego could bear. You witch, he snarled, his hand going for a decorative but deadly-looking pistol tucked in his belt. He never cleared the leather. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Silas stepped forward, grabbing Jedediah's wrist in a grip of iron. With a sharp twist, he wrenched the pistol free and sent it skittering across the porch. He shoved Jedediah back, sending him tumbling down the steps to land in a heap in the dust he so despised. The hired man on the horse shifted, his own pistol clearing its holster. I wouldn't, Silas said, his voice dangerously soft. He hadn't even looked at the man. His cold, unwavering gaze was fixed on Jedediah. Jedediah scrambled to his feet, his fine clothes covered in dirt, his face flushed with fury and shame. He looked at Silas, whose eyes promised a quiet, methodical violence that was far more terrifying than any loud threat. He looked at the woman who stood tall and unbroken, her eyes burning with a fire he had never known she possessed. He looked at his hired gun, who seemed suddenly hesitant to earn his pay. He was a man who preyed on the weak, on the silent and afraid. He did not know how to fight people who stood together, who fought back. He was a coward. This isn't over, he spat, his voice trembling with impotent rage. He wiped a smear of dust from his silk waistcoat, a pathetic attempt to regain his dignity. He clambered back onto his horse, avoiding the eyes of his own man. He pointed a shaking finger at them. You'll regret this. Then he wheeled his fine horse around and spurred it into a gallop, fleeing the scene of his defeat. The hired man lingered for a moment, then shrugged, turned his horse, and trotted off after his employer. They stood on the porch, watching until the riders were once again just two small specks on the horizon, swallowed by the vastness of the land. The dust settled. The silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was filled with the resonant hum of victory. She looked down at her hand, the one that had struck him. It was tingling. She had never known it held such power. "I was scared," she whispered, the words offered to the quiet air. "I know," Silas said, his voice still rough. He turned to her, his storm-colored eyes searching her face. "You didn't run." "No," she said, a sense of wonder in her voice. "I didn't." He reached out, not to touch her, but to pick up Jedediah's fallen pistol. He held it for a moment, then walked to the edge of the porch and threw it as far as he could into the tall prairie grass, discarding it like the trash it was. That evening, the fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter. The small house felt less like a shelter and more like a fortress, a sanctuary they had defended together. They sat at the table, the stew in their bowls untouched, the weight of the day settling around them. The unspoken thing that had grown between them now had a name: trust. It was solid and real, forged in the heat of the confrontation. Silas looked at her across the small wooden table. The firelight played on her face, illuminating the strength that had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of dust and fear. He had brought a body back from town, a shell of a person. Now, a woman sat before him. But she had no name. She was still a ghost from someone else's story. "What do they call you?" he asked. His voice was gentle, the question an invitation, not a demand. She hesitated. The name she had been given was a brand, a mark of ownership from a life she wanted to forget. It did not belong to the woman who stood on the porch, who planted flowers at a stranger's grave, who had looked a monster in the eye and said no. That name had died in the crate with the chickens. She thought for a moment, searching for a sound that felt like her own. A name she had heard once, in a song. Felt clean. Felt like hope. "Lena," she said. He tasted the name, letting it rest on his tongue for a moment before speaking it aloud. Lena, it settled in the quiet room, filling the space. It was a good, strong name. Fit her. The act of being named, of naming herself, was a quiet baptism. She was no longer just she or the woman. She was Lena. Later that night, long after Silas had gone to his bed, Lena took the tattered, foul dress she had worn on her first day. It was a relic of her past, a physical remnant of her humiliation. She had kept it folded in a small bundle at the bottom of a chest, unable to look at it but unable to part with it. She carried it to the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing red embers. She held the dress for a moment, the coarse fabric rough against her fingers. It was the skin of a life she was shedding. With a deep breath, she laid it on the coals. It did not burst into flames immediately. It smoked, smoldered, the fabric curling and blackening at the edges. Then a small tongue of orange flame licked up and caught hold. The dress began to burn, the stench of its past life rising and then dissipating into the chimney, released into the vast night sky. She watched until it was nothing but a pile of fine, gray ash, indistinguishable from the wood that had warmed her. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. And she was new. The seasons turned. Winter came, blanketing the plains in a deep, silent layer of snow. The small house became their entire world, a pocket of warmth and light against the biting cold. They fell into a comfortable domesticity, their lives woven together so tightly they were no longer two separate threads, but a single, strong cord. The locked room remained locked, but its presence was no longer a weight. It was just a part of the house, a memory that had found its peace. Spring returned, and with it, life. The garden she had planted pushed green shoots through the thawing earth. The wild roses by the porch bloomed with a fierce, untamed beauty. The land no longer felt like a place of isolation but of possibility. The house, once hollow and haunted by loss, now seemed to breathe with the quiet rhythm of their life. It was filled with the smell of baking bread, her loaves were better now, and the sound of her soft humming as she worked. One evening they sat together on the porch steps watching the sunset. It was a ritual they had adopted, a quiet moment to mark the end of the day. The sky was a masterpiece of soft pinks and deep purples. A comfortable silence stretched between them. "You're either the kindest man I've ever met," Lena said, her voice soft, "or the most foolish." Silas looked at her, a rare, genuine smile touching his lips. It transformed his weary face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. "Can't I be both?" She smiled back, a full, easy smile that reached her eyes. In that shared look, everything that had been left unsaid was finally spoken. It was not a grand declaration of love, not a passionate promise. It was something quieter, deeper, and more enduring. It was an acknowledgement of the home they had built, not just of wood and stone, but of shared silence, unspoken kindness, and mutual respect. He reached over and took her hand. His was rough and calloused, hers was smaller but just as strong. Their fingers intertwined, a natural, easy fit. They sat there for a long time, hands clasped, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon, leaving the sky to the stars. The house stood behind them, a silent witness, its windows glowing with the warm light of the fire within. It was no longer his house or her shelter. It was their home. This story, it isn't just about a rescue. The real rescue didn't happen in that dusty town with the cutting of a rope. That was just the opening of a door. The real rescue was a slower, quieter thing. It was in the thousands of silent moments that followed. It was in the sharing of a meal, the mending of a shirt, the steady presence of someone who chose to stand watch while you slept. It was in the patient work of building a new life from the ashes of an old one. It was the discovery that kindness doesn't always have a loud voice. Sometimes it's just a blanket left on a cot, a pair of boots left on a table. So here's your naming. We all have cages, some are built by others, some we build for ourselves. We all have names given to us that don't fit, hurts we carry like a ragged coat. But the story reminds us that you can choose a new name. You can burn the old coat. You can find your own porch to stand on and someone to stand with you. It reminds us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the act of taking one small step forward even when you're terrified. And if you were brave enough to take that step, if you were patient enough to do the work, you might just find that what you thought was a barren wasteland is actually a place where you can plant a garden. You might just find that the person who opens the door to your cage isn't just your rescuer. They are the home you were always journeying toward.